The rain lashed against the window of the history department, a chaotic, relentless rhythm that contrasted sharply with the absolute silence inside the office. I stood by the door, my hand hovering over the brass handle, knowing that if I turned it, I would be walking away from the most terrifying and magnetic force I had ever encountered. Dr. Iris Blackwell sat behind her mahogany desk, her silhouette framed by the storm outside, her eyes fixed on a stack of grading papers as if the world wasn't collapsing in the space between us. Everyone had warned me. They said she was stone, untouchable, a woman who had traded her heart for tenure and sealed the bargain with ice. They said she was too guarded for affection, too brilliant for vulnerability. But looking at the tension in her jaw, the slight, almost imperceptible tremor in the hand holding her pen, I knew they were wrong. I didn't leave that room. Instead, I locked the door. I did what no one else dared. I closed the distance. And this is a story of how the ice finally broke. Dr. Iris Blackwell didn't just walk into a room. She changed its atmospheric pressure. She was a study in severe monochromatic elegance, always dressed in sharp, tailored suits that ranged from charcoal to slate, armor constructed of wool and silk. Her hair was dark, threaded with premature silver that she didn't bother to hide, pinned back with a precision that bordered on aggressive. There was no softness in her presentation, no invitation to linger. She carried herself with the kind of regal isolation that suggested she didn't need people, only history. I remember the first time I sat in her lecture hall. It was a survey course on European revolutions, a subject that usually invited passionate debate. But in Dr. Blackwell's class, the air was thick with a terrified reverence. 200 undergraduates sat in absolute silence, afraid that breathing too loudly might disrupt the cadence of her lecture. She spoke without notes, her voice low and resonant, dissecting the fall of monarchies with a clinical detachment that was both terrifying and alluring. She didn't pace. She stood behind the podium like a statue, her amber eyes scanning the auditorium with an intensity that made you feel exposed, even from the back row. My fascination wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. While other students complained about her impossible grading standards, I noticed the way she would pause and look out the window when a student asked a particularly insightful question. I noticed the way she held her coffee cup, 2 hands, always, as if seeking warmth in a cold room. The decision to apply for her research assistant position was met with genuine concern from my peers. "You'll burn out in a month," my roommate warned. But the warning only sharpened my resolve. I drafted my application with meticulous care, ensuring every citation was perfect, every argument unflinching. When I received the email inviting me for an interview, my pulse jumped in my throat. It was a single sentence, devoid of pleasantries. "Report to my office at 4 p.m. Do not be late." I arrived 10 minutes early, checking my reflection in the glass of the department directory. I looked young, too young perhaps, with my messy bun and thrifted blazer, but my eyes were steady. I wasn't going there to be taught. I was going there to be seen. I walked down the long, quiet hallway toward her office, the sound of my boots on the linoleum echoing like a countdown. I didn't know it then, but I was walking toward the edge of a cliff I would eventually jump from, willingly and without a parachute. The door to her office was closed, a solid barrier of oak. I knocked, and her voice came through, clear and cool as water. "Enter." The air inside her office was different from the hallway, heavier, scented with the dust of old paper and the sharp, acidic bite of expensive espresso. It was a space curated for isolation. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined every wall, filled with volumes that looked like they had been read, argued with, and defeated. Dr. Blackwell didn't look up when I entered. She finished writing a sentence in a notebook with a fountain pen, the scratch of the nib against the paper the only sound in the room. I stood there, waiting, refusing to fidget, refusing to fill the silence with nervous apologies for my existence. Finally, she capped the pen. The sound was a sharp click that signaled I was now permitted to exist. She looked up, and the full force of her attention hit me like a physical weight. Her eyes were amber, intelligent, and completely devoid of warmth. She didn't ask me why I wanted the job. She didn't ask about my 5-year plan or my passion for history. She simply picked up a manuscript from her desk, a dense stack of papers clipped together, and held it out to me. "Page 42, she said, her voice low and smooth. "Read the second paragraph. Tell me what's wrong with it." It was a test. Not a conversation, but a trial. I took the papers, my hands steady despite the adrenaline spiking in my blood. I found the paragraph. It was an analysis of post-war economic treaties, dense with dates and figures. I read it once, then twice. The silence in the room stretched, tight as a violin string. Dr. Blackwell watched me, leaning back in her leather chair, her fingers steepled. She expected me to fail. She expected me to crumble under the pressure or offer some vague complimentary platitude about the prose. But I saw it. It was a subtle error. A date regarding the signing of the Treaty of Tilsit that was off by 2 days. A common misconception in secondary sources, but an error nonetheless. I looked up, meeting her gaze. "The date is wrong," I said. "The treaty was signed on the 7th, not the 9th. The ratification happened on the 9th. For a moment, she didn't move. The air between us seemed to freeze. I wondered if I had just ended my career before it began. If correcting the department head was the fastest way to get blacklisted. Then, slowly, the corner of her mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile. Dr. Blackwell didn't smile. But it was an acknowledgement. She reached out, took the manuscript back, and made a quick, decisive mark on the page. "Make sure you're here by 8 on Monday," she said, turning back to her notebook. "I don't tolerate lateness, and I don't repeat instructions." That was how it began. I became a fixture in her office, a quiet ghost moving through the periphery of her world. We worked in a rhythm that became almost hypnotic. I would arrive early, organize the day's materials, and verify citations while she wrote. We rarely spoke about anything other than the work. There were no questions about weekends, no small talk about the weather. But in that silence, a strange intimacy began to form. I learned the cadence of her breathing. I learned that she rubbed her left temple when she was frustrated with a paragraph. I learned that she drank her coffee black, but only until noon. After that, it was herbal tea, steeped for exactly 4 minutes. The physical awareness grew in the spaces where words were absent. One afternoon, about a month into the term, I was cross-referencing a translation at the small table she had set up for me in the corner. I was struggling with a particularly archaic phrasing, frowning at the text. I didn't hear her approach. I only realized she was there when the light shifted, her shadow falling over the page. "You're mistranslating the verb," she said. Her voice was right at my ear, closer than she had ever been. She leaned over my shoulder to point at the word, one hand resting on the back of my chair, the other hovering over the page. The air suddenly thickened, charged with the static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. She was close enough that I could smell her, sandalwood, old books, and the rain that had started to fall outside. I could feel the heat radiating from her body, a warmth that contradicted her icy reputation. I stopped breathing. I sat perfectly still, acutely aware that if I leaned back just an inch, my back would press against her front. The text on the page blurred. My entire world narrowed down to the proximity of her hand near my shoulder and the sound of her breath, slow and steady. She didn't move away immediately. She stayed there, suspended in that illicit closeness, for a beat longer than necessary. It was a breach in the wall, a momentary lapse in the rigorous discipline she applied to her existence. "It implies intent, not just action," she murmured, her voice dropping an octave, vibrating through me. "Right," I managed to whisper, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "Intent." She straightened up then, the distance returning like a physical blow. She walked back to her desk without looking at me, the click of her heels restoring the professional boundary. But the air remained charged. Working in her shadow wasn't just about history anymore. It was about waiting for the moment when that charge would finally spark. It was a Tuesday, late enough that the automatic heating in the building had cycled off, leaving the history department in a cooling, settling silence. The only sounds were the distant, rhythmic thrum of a floor buffer 3 stories down, and the relentless scratching of Dr. Blackwell's pen. We were the only 2 lights left on in the humanities wing, a lighthouse of productivity in a sea of darkened lecture halls. By this point, weeks into our arrangement, The silence between us had become a comfortable architecture, a structure we both inhabited without bumping into the walls. But that night, the structure collapsed. The phone on her desk rang. It was a jarring, mechanical shriek that cut through the quiet like a knife. Dr. Blackwell flinched, a tiny, violent motion that she immediately suppressed. She stared at the device with something resembling dread before picking up the receiver. "Mother," she said. The word was not a greeting. It was a concession. Her voice, usually a finely tuned instrument of command, went flat. I kept my head down, pretending to focus on the stack of microfiche scans in front of me, but every sense I had was tuned to her frequency. The conversation was one-sided, a series of short, clipped responses that revealed a dismantling of the woman I thought I knew. "I sent the copy last week," she said, her fingers tightening around the cord. A pause. "I am aware it's not the Yale Press. It is still a significant journal." Another pause, longer this time, filled with the tinny, indistinct scratching of a voice on the other end. I watched from the corner of my eye as Dr. Blackwell's posture changed. The steel spine curved. Her shoulders, usually squared against the world, drew inward. She looked suddenly smaller, like a child trying to make herself invisible in a room where she was taking up too much space. "I understand," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "I will try to do better next time. Yes. Goodbye." She replaced the receiver with a gentleness that was more disturbing than if she had slammed it. For a long minute, she didn't move. She just sat there, staring at the dark wood of her desk, her hands resting flat on the surface, as if she were trying to ground herself, to keep from floating away into the ether of her own disappointment. She rubbed her temples with exhausted fingers, a gesture of such raw, unguarded fatigue that it felt like an intrusion to witness it. To leave her sitting in that cold silence felt like a cruelty I couldn't commit. I stood up. The sound of my chair scraping against the floor was loud, but she didn't look up. I walked over to the small kitchenette station she kept in the corner, an electric kettle, a ceramic pot, a tin of loose-leaf tea. I went through the motions with deliberate slowness. I boiled the water, I measured the leaves, Earl Grey, her preference for late nights when she needed clarity but not the jittery edge of caffeine. I waited for the steep, counting the seconds, giving her time to reassemble her armor. When I poured the cup, the steam rose in a fragrant cloud of bergamot. I walked to her desk and placed the saucer near her right hand, careful not to encroach on her papers. I didn't say, "Are you okay?" I didn't say, "Your mother sounds difficult." Those were words for friends, for equals, and we were neither. Instead, I offered a service that was also a tether. Dr. Blackwell froze as the cup settled on the wood. She looked at the tea, watching the steam curl into the air, and then, slowly, she looked up at me. Her eyes were unguarded, stripped of their usual icy assessment. There was a crack in the porcelain surface, a flash of profound, aching loneliness that hit me in the center of my chest. She looked at me not as an assistant, but as a witness. "Thank you," she murmured. The words were rough, unused. "It's just tea," I said softly, stepping back to give her space. "It is," she agreed, but she didn't look away. She picked up the cup, wrapping both hands around the ceramic warmth. I went back to my desk. We worked for another hour, the only sound the turning of pages and the occasional clink of china against a saucer. But the distance between us had vanished. The request came 3 days later, delivered with the same clipped efficiency she applied to grading papers, though I noticed she didn't look up from her laptop when she said it. We needed to access the regional archives in a town 3 hours north. The collection was non-circulating, housed in the basement of a damp Victorian building that smelled of mildew and forgotten administrative decisions. It was an overnight trip. The grant budget covered a hotel. She said it as if it were a logistical annoyance, a necessary evil for the sake of the manuscript. But when I agreed, her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, a release of tension that was the only sign she had been waiting for my answer. The drive was a study in controlled silence. Dr. Blackwell drove her vintage Volvo with aggressive competence, hands at 10 and 2, eyes scanning the highway as if the road itself might try to argue with her. I watched the landscape blur from green to gray, acutely aware of the enclosed space of the car interior. It felt like a capsule, sealing us off from the rest of the world, trapping her scent, that distinct mix of sandalwood, rain, and old paper, in the air conditioning vents. The archives were worse than I imagined. We were relegated to a private viewing room in the sub-basement, a windowless cell with flickering fluorescent lights that hummed with a headache-inducing frequency. The archivist, a man who looked as dusty as his files, deposited 3 cartloads of heavy, leather-bound ledgers on a table that was clearly designed for a single, solitary scholar. "We will have to share," Dr. Blackwell said, looking at the narrow table with disdain. "I don't mind," I said, perhaps too quickly. She looked at me then, a sharp, assessing glance that lingered on my face for a second too long before she nodded. "Very well. Let's begin." We sat side by side. There was no other way. To read the ledgers, we had to lean in, our shoulders brushing every time one of us turned a page. The proximity was suffocating and intoxicating in equal measure. She worked with a terrifying focus, her gloved hands turning the brittle pages with reverence, her profile carved from stone in the harsh light. But as the hours wore on, the air in the room changed. The ventilation system wheezed and died, leaving the small space growing steadily warmer. I could feel the heat radiating from her body. It was a physical presence, a magnetic field that seemed to pull at my own skin. I found myself reading the same sentence 4 times, the words dissolving into nonsense because my entire consciousness was focused on the few inches of space between her elbow and mine. I watched the way a loose strand of hair escaped her severe bun and curled against the nape of her neck, a tiny rebellion against her discipline. I wanted, with a terrifying suddenness, to reach out and tuck it back into place. The inevitable happened around 2 p.m. We both reached for the heavy index volume at the center of the table. My hand landed on the leather cover, just as hers did. Her fingers, usually cool and dry, brushed against my knuckles. They were warm. We both froze. In any other context, with any other professor, it would have been a clumsy accident, a quick, "excuse me," and a retreat. But with Iris Blackwell, nothing was accidental. The contact was electric, a jolt that went straight to the base of my spine. She didn't pull her hand away immediately. For a heartbeat, a long, suspended second that felt like an hour, she left her fingers resting against mine. I looked up, and she was already looking at me. Her amber eyes were dark, the pupils blown wide despite the bright lights. The silence in the basement was absolute. No hum of the fan, no scratching of pens, just the sound of our breathing, which had synced up without permission. I saw the conflict warring behind her eyes. "The index," she whispered. Her voice was rough, like silk dragged over gravel. "I have it," I said, but I didn't move my hand. "It's heavy." "I can manage the weight," she replied, but the words lacked her usual bite. They sounded defensive, almost breathless. "You don't have to," I countered, holding her gaze. "Not always." She flinched, just slightly, as if I had touched a bruise. Then, with a visible effort of will, she withdrew her hand, clasping it tightly in her lap. "Turn the page, Maya. We are losing daylight." We worked for another 3 hours, but the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The air was thick, charged with things unsaid. Every time she shifted in her chair, I felt it. Every time I exhaled, she seemed to tense. We were 2 planets pulled into a decaying orbit, the gravity becoming impossible to resist. The drive to the hotel that evening was different. The professional distance she tried to reestablish crumbled under the weight of the dark highway. The car felt smaller than before. The dashboard lights cast a soft green glow on her face, softening the sharp angles of her jaw. She didn't turn on the radio. She didn't talk about the research. She just drove, her grip on the wheel white-knuckled, as if she were holding on to the last shred of her control. I watched her hands, thinking about the warmth I had felt in the archives, knowing with a terrifying certainty that things were about to change. The hotel bar was a cavern of low light and velvet, a place designed for secrets and the kind of conversations that dissolve with the morning sun. We sat in a booth at the far back, away from the few other patrons, mostly weary businessmen nursing scotches and staring at their phones. The distance from the university acted like a physical solvent, loosening the rigid structures that defined our existence on campus. Here, she wasn't the department head, and I wasn't the assistant. We were just two women sitting in the semi-darkness, the air between us humming with the residue of what had happened, or almost happened, in the archives. Dr. Blackwell had removed her blazer, draping it over the back of the leather seat. It was a small gesture, but on her, it felt like a shedding of skin. Beneath the armor of the suit, she wore a silk blouse the color of cream, the fabric softening the sharp lines of her shoulders. She ordered a bottle of heavy, complex red wine without asking for my preference, pouring 2 glasses with a steady hand. "You're staring," she said, not looking up from the wine as the crimson liquid swirled in the glass. "I've never seen you without the armor," I admitted, the wine making me bold. She paused, the bottle hovering over the table. She looked at her own reflection in the dark window next to us, her expression unreadable. "Armor is necessary when you are walking through a battlefield, Maya. Academia is not known for its kindness to women who bleed." She took a drink, a long, slow sip that let her close her eyes for a fraction of a second. When she opened them, the amber was darker, clouded with something that looked suspiciously like regret. "They call me the Sentinel because they think I feel nothing," she said, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated in the center of my chest. "They think I chose this life, the solitude, the late nights, the silence, because I prefer books to human touch." "I know that's not true," I said quietly. She laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "Do you? You're 24, Maya. You see the romance in the tragic figure. You don't see the cost." She turned the stem of her glass between her fingers, staring at the movement with hypnotic intensity. 10 years ago, there was someone. Her name was Elena. She was brilliant, warm, everything I wasn't. She stayed for 3 years. She tried to plant flowers in the winter of my personality. I held my breath, afraid that if I exhaled, the confession would stop. This was the ghost story the grad students whispered about, the tragedy that had cemented the legend. "She left the night I got tenure," Iris continued, her eyes fixed on the past. "She told me that loving me was like trying to hold a knife by the blade. She said I didn't know how to be soft, that I would always choose the safety of my intellect over the risk of intimacy. And she was right. I watched her pack her bags, and I didn't stop her. I couldn't." She looked up at me then, her gaze stripping me bare. It was a look of profound vulnerability, a confession that she believed herself to be fundamentally broken, incapable of the basic mechanics of love. "I am not a soft thing, Maya," she whispered, the admission hanging in the air like smoke. "I am sharp edges and closed doors. I will cut you if you try to hold me." The warning was clear, but it didn't frighten me. It pulled me in. I leaned across the table, invading her space. "I don't want soft," I said, my voice steady. "Soft is easy. Soft breaks under pressure. I think the way you've survived is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." The use of her first name was a transgression, a crossing of the line that we couldn't walk back from. She stared at me, her lips slightly parted, the air charging between us until it felt thick enough to choke on. She didn't pull away. For a moment, I thought she might reach out, might bridge the gap across the mahogany table. "You are dangerous," she murmured, but it sounded like a compliment. We finished the wine in a silence that was no longer empty. It was heavy, filled with the terrifying possibility of what might happen next. The walk to the elevators was a blur of hotel carpet and shared gravity. We stood shoulder to shoulder in the lift, watching the numbers climb, neither of us speaking, both of us acutely aware that we were heading to rooms that were next door to each other. When we reached her door, she stopped. She swiped her keycard, the green light blinking in the dim hallway, but she didn't open it. She turned to me, her back against the wood. The hallway was narrow. I was close enough to smell the wine on her breath, to see the pulse jumping in the hollow of her throat. "Go to your room, Maya," she said, but she didn't move. Her eyes dropped to my mouth, then snapped back up to my eyes, panic and desire warring in her expression. "Is that what you want?" I asked, stepping closer until the fabric of my jacket brushed against her silk blouse. "It's what I need," she corrected, her voice trembling. "Because if you come inside, I won't let you leave." The admission hung there, raw and terrifying. She was giving me an out. She was telling me to run while the gate was still open. But I didn't want to run. I wanted to be trapped. I looked at her for one long, agonizing second, memorizing the way she looked when she was on the edge of surrender. "Good night, Iris," I whispered. I turned and walked to my own door, feeling her eyes on my back like a physical touch. I heard her door open and close only after I had unlocked my own, the sound of the latch clicking into place, echoing like a gunshot in the quiet corridor. We were separated by a wall, but the foundation had already cracked. The return to campus reality was violent in its swiftness. The moment the tires of her Volvo hit the faculty parking lot, the woman who had leaned across a table and confessed her fear of softness evaporated. In her place sat Dr. Iris Blackwell, reassembled and terrifyingly distant. She didn't say goodbye when I gathered my bag. She simply checked her watch, adjusted her blazer, and said, "I expect the transcription of the archive notes on my desk by noon tomorrow." Her voice was stripped of all the gravel and wine-dark resonance it had held the night before. It was glass again, smooth, transparent, and cold. The following week was a masterclass in emotional erasure. Iris didn't just rebuild the fortress. She reinforced the foundations with a cruelty I hadn't seen before. It was as if she needed to punish both of us for the lapse in judgment, to prove that the crack in the armor had been a hallucination of the lighting, not a fundamental structural failure. She became hypercritical, dismantling my work with a surgical precision that felt personal. Where before she had offered guidance, now she offered only red ink. She returned my draft of the grant proposal covered in slash marks, her handwriting jagged and aggressive in the margins. "Sloppy," she had written next to a paragraph she had praised 2 weeks ago. "Lacks rigor." The pain of her withdrawal wasn't just professional. It was a physical ache. She treated me not like a colleague or a student, but like a stranger she found mildly irritating. She avoided eye contact with a determination that bordered on pathological. If we were in the same room, she would find a reason to look at a bookshelf, a screen, a window, anywhere but at me. It was a specific kind of gaslighting, designed to make me question the reality of what had happened in the hotel hallway. I oscillated between fury and heartbreak. Part of me wanted to retreat, to take the hint and fade back into the background of the department, to become just another graduate student, terrified of the Ice Queen. It would have been safer. It would have saved my career. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't unknow the warmth of her hand in the archives. I couldn't unhear the way she had whispered my name in the dark. I knew that this coldness wasn't an absence of feeling. It was a panic response. She was terrified. The betrayal came in small, stinging doses. On Thursday, she assigned me to reorganize the entire physical filing system for the department's older dissertations, a task usually reserved for undergraduate work-study students. It was busy work, designed to keep me out of her office. I spent hours in the dusty storage room, my hands dry and paper cut, listening to the silence of the building and feeling the anger rise in my throat like bile. When I tried to speak to her after a seminar on Friday, she cut me off before I could even open my mouth. "I am busy, Maya," she said, turning her back to me to organize papers that were already perfectly aligned. "If it isn't regarding the syllabus, send an email." "It's not about the syllabus," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "It's about—" "Then it is not a priority," she snapped. She didn't turn around. Her shoulders were tense, drawn up tight toward her ears. "Close the door on your way out." I stood there for a long moment, staring at the back of her head, watching the rigid line of her posture. I realized then that she wasn't just pushing me away. She was daring me to leave. She was testing the hypothesis that everyone eventually leaves Iris Blackwell. She was trying to accelerate the inevitable heartbreak so she could control the timeline. The weather turned on Friday afternoon, mirroring the unsustainable pressure building inside the department. The sky turned a bruised, heavy purple, and the wind began to rattle the old window panes of the humanities building. The air grew heavy, charged with the static of an approaching storm. Most of the faculty left early, eager to beat the rain, but I stayed. I sat at my desk in the outer office, watching the lightning flash in the distance, listening to the thunder roll closer. I knew she was still in there. I could hear the pacing. She was walking back and forth in her office, a caged animal sensing the barometric drop. The distance she had put between us was a lie, and the storm was about to wash it away. I decided then that I wasn't going to leave. I wasn't going to let her win this war of attrition. If she wanted a storm, I would give her one. The storm broke with a violence that felt personal. A crack of thunder shook the floorboards beneath my feet, vibrating up through my boots, and the overhead lights in the outer office flickered once, twice, and then died. The room plunged into a gray, watery twilight, illuminated only by the strobe light flashes of lightning tearing through the sky outside. In the sudden gloom, the silence of the department felt heavy, suffocating. I didn't wait for the power to return. I didn't wait for permission. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, and walked to her door. I didn't knock. I turned the handle and pushed it open. Iris was standing by the window, her silhouette framed against the chaos of the storm. She spun around at the sound of the door, her hand flying to her throat. For a split second, before the mask slipped back into place, I saw it. Naked, unadulterated panic. She looked wild, her hair escaping its pins, her chest heaving with breaths she couldn't quite catch. "I told you to leave, Maya," she said, her voice tight, straining for authority but landing somewhere near desperation. "The roads will be impassable in an hour. You need to go." "I'm not worried about the roads," I said. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The click of the latch was soft, but in the quiet room, it sounded like a gavel coming down. I locked it. Iris heard the sound. Her eyes widened, the amber swallowed by the dilation of her pupils. She took a step back, retreating until her hips hit the edge of her heavy mahogany desk. It was her command center, her barricade, the physical manifestation of the distance she kept between herself and the world. "You are being insubordinate," she snapped, gripping the edge of the desk until her knuckles turned white. "Unlock that door. That is a direct order." "No," I said. I walked toward her. I didn't stop at the guest chairs where students were supposed to sit and tremble. I kept walking until I reached the desk, and then, completely ignoring the invisible boundary of academia, I walked around it. "Maya, stop!" It was the sentinel's voice, the tone that could freeze a lecture hall of 300 people. It was a command designed to make people shrink, to remind them of the hierarchy, the tenure, the legendary coldness of Dr. Iris Blackwell. But I wasn't a student anymore. I was the woman who had felt her hand tremble in the archives. I kept moving until I was standing inside her personal space, invading the sanctuary she had defended for decades. I was close enough to see the fine tremor in her lower lip, close enough to smell the fear and the sandalwood perfume that seemed to spike with the heat of her skin. "Make me," I challenged softly. The words hung in the air, charged and heavy. "If you want me to leave, Iris, you have to look me in the eye. Really look at me, and tell me that what happened in the hotel meant nothing. Tell me you don't feel the electricity in this room right now." It is inappropriate," she stammered, the sharp, precise vocabulary she wielded like a weapon finally failing her. She pressed herself back against the desk, trying to put inches between us where there were none left. "I am your professor. I am 20 years your senior. I am a history of cold rooms and colder decisions. I am trying to protect you from a mistake." "You're not protecting me," I whispered, stepping closer, my body nearly brushing hers. "You're protecting yourself. You're terrified that if you let me in, you won't know how to be the sentinel anymore." "I am not soft, Maya," she cried out, the confession tearing out of her. "I will break you. I don't know how to do this, how to be gentle, how to be what you need." "I never asked for gentle," I said. I reached out. It was the dare made manifest. My hand found the side of her face, my palm cupping the sharp line of her jaw. Her skin was burning, fever hot against my cool fingers. She flinched, a sharp intake of breath like she'd been burned, but she didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering shut, her defenses crumbling into dust. "You're shaking," I noted, my thumb brushing the high curve of her cheekbone. "I'm angry," she lied, her voice breaking on the last syllable. "No," I said, tilting her face up so she had to look at me. "You're starving." She made a sound, a low, desperate noise in the back of her throat, and then the waiting was over. She grabbed the lapels of my blazer, pulling me forward with a strength that shocked me, and crushed her mouth against mine. It wasn't a tentative first kiss. It was a collision. It was a claiming. It was the taste of months of silence and years of repression exploding all at once. Her lips were soft but demanding, moving against mine with a frantic, heavy rhythm. She tasted like coffee and rain and desperate need. I made a noise of surprise that was swallowed by her mouth as she deepened the kiss, her tongue tangling with mine, her hands fisting in my hair, pulling me closer until there was no air left between us. We stumbled back, her hips hitting the desk hard, knocking a stack of grading papers onto the floor in a chaotic rustle that neither of us acknowledged. The sentinel was gone. In her place was a woman who was terrified and alive, a woman who kissed like she was drowning, and I was the only oxygen left in the world. I pressed her down against the wood, my hands roaming over the silk of her blouse, feeling the frantic hammer of her heart beneath my palm, answering her hunger with my own. The storm raged outside, rattling the glass, but the real violence was in the way she surrendered, the way she finally, beautifully, let the walls come down. The morning sun didn't bring clarity. It brought a forensic audit of our actions. The storm had passed, leaving the office bathed in a harsh, unforgiving light that highlighted the dust motes dancing in the air and the disarray of the papers we had knocked to the floor. Iris was pacing the length of the room, her heels clicking a frantic staccato rhythm against the hardwood. She had reassembled her physical armor, hair pinned back with severe precision, the top button of her blouse fastened tight, but the energy radiating from her was jagged. She was reciting the faculty handbook like a penance, listing every statute we had violated as if the words alone could rebuild the wall between us. "It is a violation of Ethical Code 4.2, she said, her voice tight, refusing to look at me. She picked up a book and immediately put it back down, her hands trembling. The power dynamic is insurmountable. The age gap is predatory. I am 52 years old, Maya. You are 24. I am the department head and you are a research assistant. If this gets out, you won't just lose your funding. You will be marked. They will say I used my position to exploit you." "They can say whatever they want," I said, my voice quiet but steady. I was sitting in the guest chair watching her unravel. But we both know who pursued who. I walked around the desk, Iris. I locked the door. She stopped pacing and turned to me, her expression a wreckage of panic and longing. "That doesn't matter to the dean. It doesn't matter to the board. I have spent 30 years building a reputation as a woman who is beyond reproach, a woman who is disciplined. And in one night..." She trailed off, gesturing vaguely to the space between us, the air still thick with the memory of the night before. "I cannot be the reason your career ends before it begins. We have to stop. We have to pretend this was a lapse in judgment induced by the storm." "No," I said. I stood up and crossed the room, stopping just outside her personal space. "I won't let you rewrite history this time. You don't get to edit this out." "I am trying to protect you," she snapped, the sentinel flaring to life one last time. "I don't need protection from you," I countered. "I need you to stop being afraid of your own happiness. You said you weren't soft. Prove it. Be strong enough to want this." The challenge hung in the air. She stared at me, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Slowly, the panic began to recede, replaced by a resignation that looked dangerously like hope. She closed her eyes and let out a long, shaky breath. "If we do this," she whispered, "no one can know. Not until the term ends. Not until you are no longer under my direct supervision. Absolute discretion, Maya. I cannot have you becoming a subject of campus gossip." "Discretion," I agreed, stepping closer until I could smell the lingering scent of her perfume. "But no retreating. You don't get to treat me like a stranger in the hallways. You don't get to look through me." "I don't think I could look through you anymore even if I tried," she admitted, opening her eyes. The amber was warm again. The ice melted. We established the ground rules in the quiet of that morning, negotiating the terms of our surrender. We would be colleagues in public, partners in the shadows. It was a dangerous game, but the thrill of it was a narcotic. The following weeks became a study in duality. In the lecture hall, Dr. Blackwell was as formidable as ever, dismantling lazy arguments and commanding the room with her terrifying intellect. But I knew the truth. I knew the texture of the skin beneath the suit. There was a specific moment, 2 weeks later, that defined our new reality. We were working late in the library, sitting across from each other at a long oak table, surrounded by stacks of reference books. The room was filled with other students, the air heavy with the quiet murmur of study. To anyone watching, we were just a professor and her assistant reviewing a bibliography. But under the table, hidden by the heavy wood and the shadows, her foot found mine. She pressed the sole of her boot against my ankle, a solid, grounding weight. I looked up from my laptop. Iris was reading a monograph, her face a mask of professional concentration. She didn't smile, she didn't break character, but the pressure against my leg increased, a secret, silent claim. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was a terrifying, exhilarating secret. The knowledge that the woman everyone feared, the sentinel who guarded the gates of history, was holding on to me in the dark, refusing to let go. We were living in the eye of the storm now, and for the first time, neither of us wanted to leave. The end of the term didn't arrive with a bang, but with the quiet, bureaucratic shuffle of final grades and the heavy, ceremonial thud of graduation robes. When I finally walked across the stage to receive my degree, the humidity of the gymnasium pressing down on us, Iris was there. She sat in the front row of the faculty section, wearing her academic regalia like medieval armor. To the rest of the auditorium, she was the formidable Dr. Blackwell, the department head who frightened freshmen just by breathing. But when I took my diploma, she didn't just offer the standard, polite nod. She held my gaze for a fraction of a second longer than protocol allowed, her eyes warm with a pride that had nothing to do with my GPA. It was a silent promise. The contract was over. The hierarchy was dissolved. We stopped hiding the next day. It wasn't a press release or a public declaration. It was a slow, deliberate exhaling of breath we'd been holding for months. The first time we walked down Main Street holding hands, I felt the tension radiate through her arm, a physical bracing for impact. She was waiting for the sky to fall, for the dean to materialize from the pavement, for the world to revoke her standing. When nothing happened, when the traffic kept moving and the pedestrians ignored us, she squeezed my fingers, a silent concession to the terrifying freedom of being just Iris. The domestic reality of the woman everyone called the Sentinel is a secret I hoard greedily. The academic world still sees the iron spine and the tailored suits, but I see the Sunday mornings. I see Iris Blackwell in oversized cashmere sweaters, her hair loose and messy, reading trashy paperback mysteries she claims are for structural narrative analysis. She surrounds herself with plants now, filling the corners of our living room with ferns and orchids, living things that require the very tenderness she once claimed she lacked. I see the softness she swore didn't exist. It's in the way she lets me read the raw, messy drafts of her new manuscript while she cooks, trusting me with her unfinished thoughts in a way she never trusted anyone with her polished ones. It's in the way she falls asleep on the sofa on Friday nights, her head resting heavily on my lap, the vigilance finally powered down. The nickname has faded into a private joke, a relic of a war we've already won. Sometimes, when she's being particularly stubborn about a historical fact, or refusing to admit she needs glasses to read the menu, I'll whisper, "Careful, the Sentinel is showing." She doesn't scowl anymore. She just laughs, a low, warm sound that vibrates through the quiet house, and tells me that even sentinels need someone to watch the gate while they sleep. Looking back at that first day, the rain lashing against the office window, the terrifying precipice of her closed door, I realized the risk was astronomical. I risked my future. She risked her legacy. We gambled everything on the hunch that the electricity in the archives wasn't just static, that the woman behind the desk was starving for something she couldn't name. And we won. We built a new history, one not recorded in departmental ledgers or footnotes, but in the quiet, steady rhythm of a life shared without walls. The rain is falling again tonight, tapping a familiar rhythm against the glass. But inside, the fire is lit. Iris is standing by the window, her silhouette softened by the amber glow of the lamp. She isn't looking at the storm anymore. She's turning to smile at me, and there is no armor left, only the woman who finally learned that being guarded doesn't mean being alone. If you believe some walls are meant to be breached, subscribe for more stories of forbidden longing.